Okay, welcome everybody. This is the LCE webinar, Jumping Ship on the Old Leadership Style. I'm David Marquet. We have some people on the phone only, and we have some people who've logged in through WebEx. A note for those on WebEx, we are going to do everything in the chat window. So if things go according to plan here, I'll talk about 20 minutes, then we'll have about 10 minutes Q&A, and there's a Q&A tab, but we won't use that. Just enter your questions into the chat. Okay, I'm going to start with these two facts, which I find curious. First is we have this situation where we have high unemployment, and at the same time we have the highest level of worker dissatisfaction that we've had since the Conference Board started conducting their worker satisfaction surveys in 1987. So it strikes me as odd because you would think that at such high levels of unemployment, people would be happy just to have a job. That's not the case. Okay, I'm going to take us back to the Santa Fe, because I'm going to use a couple stories there to illustrate some of the points that I'd like to make. When I got to the ship was not doing well. The previous captain had resigned. Only 3 people had re-enlisted the year before, which is the lowest in the submarine force in the Navy. The ship was not doing well on inspections. And when I walked around the ship, people were, generally walking with their heads down. On a submarine with very narrow passageways, you can't ignore the fact that you're passing someone. It's kind of like passing someone on an airplane. But what would happen is they would just sort of bump into me and mutter and go on. I was sitting in the XO stateroom before I actually took over, and at one point the navigator walked in and said, "Hey, XO," toward the end of the day, "Hey, XO, do you have anything for me?" And the XO looked a little bit surprised and said, no, that's fine." And the navigator took off. And because of the XO's reaction and his body language, my sense was this wasn't normal. So this was kind of a show for me, the new captain. And they thought this was good. They thought this checkout thing was a good thing. But it struck me as, and I asked the XO this question, "XO, why is it your job to tell the navigator what his job is? Why isn't the navigator's job to figure out what his job is?" After we got underway, I did a drill, and in this drill, we were going to shut down the reactor. We simulate a fault, but we actually shut down the reactor. And when the reactor shut down, we shift propulsion to what's called the emergency propulsion motor, or EPM. Now, every other ship I've been on, there were 2 speeds on the EPM, 1/3 and 2/3. And when you go 1/3 on the EPM, which makes the ship just go very slowly through the water, you're draining the battery until you can shift power over to the diesel. So you have to drive the ship up to periscope depth so that you can get air and run the diesel. Now, to make things a little spicier for the nukes, the guys who operate the propulsion plant, we would order ahead 2/3 on the EPM, and the battery amp hour meter, which was this meter in maneuvering, had this audible click, and instead of going click, 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 it would go click, 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 click. There's a very visceral pressure on the operators to get the nuclear reactor started up again. And so since this was one of my first drills on the ship, and we didn't want anyone to think that the new captain wasn't tough, I said, "Well, hey, officer of the deck," I was standing in the back of the control room, "Officer of the deck, why don't we give the nuke something to think about? Let's go ahead 2/3 on the EPM." And he orders it, helm ahead 2/3. And I'm looking all the way forward in the control room now to the back of the head of the helmsman, who's sort of squirming in his seat. Immediately I sense that there's an issue. And I say, "Helm, what's up?" "Captain, there is no 2/3 on the EPM." And so I grabbed the officer of deck and I said, well, first I said, "That's great, good job, good job." I asked Officer Deck, this was one of my department heads, "Why did you order a head 2/3? Did you know there was no head 2/3 on the EPM?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Why'd you order it?" "Well, you told me to." Now, the problem here is not that there wasn't enough leadership. The problem was there was too much leadership. It was too much of the wrong kind of leadership. And the leadership was the leadership that they've been taught, which is to follow orders. So in both cases, the crew was simply enacting this role of following orders. And what's the cost? Well, I like to think of the cost in two sort of dimensions, and you've probably experienced both of these. On the one hand, from the employee point of view, we've suffered through bosses who are dictatorial, overly questioning, and they don't give us enough control over our intellectual work. And you sort of strive to do a good job, but it's almost in spite of the leadership environment of the company. On the other hand, as employers, we're frustrated with employees who don't seem to take ownership, don't have intellectual commitment, seem to leave some of their best ideas on the floor and don't bring them to work. And both of these are manifestations of the same cost of this way of doing business. But there are more costs. The leadership style doesn't actually work. And I'm going to show you just a couple slides here. Now, this is the picture. This is the Ehime Maru, which is on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. On the 9th of February, 2001, the USS Greenville ran into the Ehime Maru while conducting a demonstration emergency surface. Now, we know from the geography and how fast the ships were moving prior to the event. The Greenville came to periscope depth. The captain himself looked through the periscope and did a 360-degree spin around. He said there were no contacts. The ship went deep, did the emergency surface, and came up under the Ehime Maru. We know from this time, distance, speed calculations that the Ehime Maru had to be visible in the periscope. We don't know why the captain didn't see her. We do know that the ship had been tracking the Ehime Maru on sonar for an hour, and that the solution was actually fairly close. But once the captain said he didn't see the ship, no one on the crew said, but Captain, my solution is pretty close. Are you sure you don't see it? Let's look down the bearing again. And my ship, the Santa Fe, was in peril of going down the same path, as I explained when the ops of the deck, when I suggested a particular order, which was inappropriate, and he went ahead and conducted it. This is the USS San Francisco. She ran into a submerged seamount on the 7th of January, 2005 at full speed. Sadly, one crew member was killed. And this is the USS Hartford. She was operating in the Strait of the Hormuz on the 20th of March, 2009, crossing the strait at periscope depth when another Navy ship, the USS New Orleans, hit her broadside and knocked the sail. And you can see the sail, which is that upper part, is actually bent over at an angle. And I bring these issues up to identify the fact that this leadership model is highly dependent upon how the person at the top does, what his performance or her performance is. And if that person is technically competent, things can go well for a time. But as soon as they make a mistake, you're going to have significant problems. So what I like to encourage organizations to do is to decouple the performance of their organization from this person at the top and to embed the goodness of the organization in the people and the protocols of the organization. Now, popular thinkers and studiers of leadership and practitioners of leadership, I think, are recognizing these shortcomings. And there have been a number of responses, and I list some of them here. And these are all good and I think correct responses. We have Collins and Porras, and they're built to last and now good to great. They're talking about how mechanisms are the way to go over personality. Stephen Covey is talking about how the shift from physical labor to intellectual labor is changing the fundamental nature of how we should think about leadership. Daniel Pink in Drive is exploring the idea that we're not externally motivated, but we are internally motivated. Atul Gawande in the Checklist Manifesto, which came out recently, talks about when he's looking at how doctors operate in the operating room, how we shouldn't rely on memory and the personality of the lead doctor, but checklists instead, and it's an appropriate response to added complexity. And then Brampman and Beckstrom in the Starfish and the Spider, where they talk about leaderless organizations. Now, on this particular point, I like to think about not leaderless organizations, but organizations where everyone acts as a leader. Now, taken as a whole, I think these are all correct, but I think these are not quite complete. And we're going to get to that. Now, in general, one of the responses that, well, we need to empower our people. And so I'm going to sort of focus the next couple minutes on this issue of empowerment and use that as the foil through which we look at this new leadership model, which I'm advocating. Now, empowerment is hard, and it's hard for a couple of reasons. First, there's a legitimate concern that when we empower our employees, and we'll just say that loosely, that means I'm giving decision-making power further down the organization. I'm letting the people in the middle and the lower parts of the organization have more influence and impact over the decisions. One thing is I'm worried that they're going to make bad decisions. I mean, that's a legitimate concern. Now, we found on the submarine that when we increased the empowerment, we actually had a little bit of trouble at the beginning because I didn't recognize that the competence of the organization wasn't at the level where it supported higher levels of empowerment. And I like to think of this now as a three-legged stool. You can push decision-making down, but if your people don't have the underlying technical competence, now on a nuclear-powered submarine, it's easy. I mean, there's laws of physics of how you operate the reactor plant, but we can all imagine in our jobs and in our work that there are certain fundamental technical skills that I need to have. So empowerment by itself is not a good program. Empowerment needs to be coupled with this issue of competence and ensuring there's competence in your workforce. The second half, or the third piece of that stool, is this issue of clarity of what we are about. And then I would use this slide here, kill the bastards. Now, it seems perhaps blunt, but what I find in organizations is that if they're unclear with themselves what they're really about, or they are really about one thing and they talk about something else, besides the fact that that gets perceived as falseness by the employees, when people are down making decisions for your organization, they are going to align, they're going to test their decisions against the guiding principles and what they perceive the fundamental reason for the organization is. And if they're not clear on that, or they've got the misconception there, then they're going to start making decisions which are not aligned to supporting your organizational goals. So it's very important also that you use mechanisms to talk about with your organization what your fundamental organization is about. Now, I encourage organizations not to give a lot of speeches, send emails, and pontificate to their employees, but simply to take action and implement mechanisms that change the way they behave or the way they talk. And so I talk about talking our way first, or acting our way first, into new ways of thinking. So I'll give you a couple examples. So on the Santa Fe, we had this issue of people waiting around to be told what to do. So we tried to flip that on its head. One of the mechanisms that we used was this one of, well, let's just change our language. Instead of saying, quote, request permission, I'm going to say, I intend to. So for example, when it comes to submerging the ship, even though the book says the captain will authorize the submerging of the ship, and on every other submarine, it would go like this: Captain requests to submerge the ship, submerge the ship, submerge the ship I. Then the officer deck would turn to the diving officer, diving officer, dive, submerge the ship, submerge the ship I, and so on. So we said, we're not going to do that. No one's going to ask permission anymore. What we're going to say is, Captain, I intend to. So the first time we tried it, it was, Captain, I intend to submerge the ship. And there'd be a pause, and I said, well, what do you think I'm thinking when you're telling me you're about to submerge a ship? Well, you're probably wondering if it's safe. That's right. So how do I know it's safe? Well, you're probably going to want to know All men are below, hatches are shut, ship is rigged for dive, we've checked the water depth, the water is deep enough to submerge, and we're in water that's been assigned to the Santa Fe. So I said, okay, that's great. So why don't you just tell me that? And so what would happen is the officer of the deck would, instead of just saying, I intend to, we would say, Captain, the ship's in water that we own, water depth has been checked, etc., and I intend to submerge the ship. And then I would say, very well, and we would submerge. Well, you can see what's happening. Very powerfully, the ownership for this decision to submerge the ship and every other decision then migrated to the next lower level. It becomes the officer of the deck's decision, and this was translated down the chain of command. The second thing that happens is, and this plays on this issue of competence, is they get to articulate. They have to think about what the next higher person in the chain of command is thinking and are forced to articulate that view. And that allows a dialogue, and that's where you get this competence. So we had no leadership development program. We saved all that time and effort and money. We didn't need a leadership development program. The way we ran the organization was the leadership development program. I'll give you another example on what you receive when you're on a submarine. Is you receive a nearly unending stream of messages that tell you to check certain things. If you have a certain solenoid valve that was made by a certain company, replace it. If hey, we're taking data on how the CO2 scrubber works. Report if you have this kind. Take that every month. Send it in. And so the way ships have managed that stream of messages and requirements is they create what we call a tickler. Now, this is not, it doesn't actually tickle. We would then sit in these meetings where the XO would go to the tickler and message number one, engineer, what's the status of this? And we'd spend painful hours going through what, who owed what and what was the status. Now, on ships that are incredibly disorganized, and this is the way the Santa Fe was when I first got there, you have no tickler and the things aren't getting done. So we started getting better, and we said, well, we're going to have this, now we're going to have a tickler and we're going to start getting things done. And that was good to a point. And then in this dramatic meeting, I sat there and I took the tickler and I said, okay, here we're going to now go to the highest level of maturity. And I threw the binder in the trash and said, I am no longer going to have these meetings. I'm not going to dedicate any management and leadership time and effort to tracking these events. You are now responsible for making these happen. Now, I won't pretend that we didn't miss a few things here and there, but the things we missed generally weren't important. And the power of giving the department heads the responsibility for their jobs dramatically overweighed what small admin deficiencies were notched up on our ship. Okay, so our model right now, our Western civilization model of leadership, I would describe as leaders lead people. And that sounds wonderful until you think about what the implied consequence is, which is that people follow people. Now, when we do empowerment, it's hard, A, for those legitimate reasons of competence and clarity, but it's also hard because it always seemed like we were acting against some force. And finally, at the end of my tour, I realized that this force that we're acting against is this vision that we have of leadership that casts people into follower roles. And when you tell people that they're followers and they think that they're supposed to act like followers and they've acted like followers for 20, 25, 30 years, then you have to spend a lot of energy undoing that. And so our idea is never to cast them into follower mode to begin with, to simply say, we're not going to go there. We're just going to have people lead themselves. And so that's essentially my opening statement, and we've got about 20 minutes. So what I'd like to do is now open it up to questions. And so first, let's go to I'd like, if you're on the computer, if you want to go ahead and type into the chat window, that's great. And then let's open it up to a question. The first question I'll take will be on the from phone call-in person. Okay, question. Michelle, can you still hear me? Are we still on the air? Oh, okay. I have a fundamental misconception. You can only listen. No one can talk. All right. If you have questions, let's go ahead and put them up in the chat window. All right. Meantime, I'll stall for time. I'll give you another mechanism. So we got to the ship, and like I talked about this. I gave you this picture of everyone muttering and sort of looking at their feet. And we said, well, what's the problem? Well, we're not proud of the ship. No one's proud of the ship. No one wants to be here. We're embarrassed, etc. And we had this inspection where the Commodore was going to come down in 2 weeks. And we knew that we needed to buy some time. We need to buy some time to implement the changes we wanted. So we got together with the guys and we said, hey, what can we do? How can we show the inspectors and convince them that it's a new ship? There's a new liveliness in the step on board the Santa Fe. And you start that conversation, people would say things like, well, we want them to be proud. We want them to greet visitors cheerily. We want them to hold their head up. Those are a little bit hard to actually practice. So what happens is we said, well, let's come up with a rule. We came up with a 3-name rule. And the 3-name rule went like this. When you meet someone, we want you to use your name, the ship's name, and their name. So when Commodore Kenny would come on board, we'd say, Commodore Kenny, welcome aboard USS Santa Fe. My name's Petty Officer Martinez. So there you have the 3 names. Now, so this inspection, we told people, hey, we didn't give a speech, and we said, let's do this. And when the inspection team came on board, I noticed that only about 10% of the people were doing it. And so I'm kind of disappointed and angry and pissed off. So what happens is at the end, the Commodore comes in and says, this is a totally new ship. I'm shocked. I said, what do you mean? He said, all day for the last 3 days, my inspectors have been telling me, you guys are turning things around. And what happened was even that 10% was enough. But again, this just goes to the power mechanisms. Okay, great. We're getting some questions. All right, George says, what are some examples of people leading themselves, and how do you get people to do it as a culture? I think there are a couple of companies out there that are doing this. I think models like, for example, a law firm where everyone is sort of a partner and independently charting their own path. The problem the obvious question is, well, if the leader doesn't lead the people and the people don't follow the leader, then what do the people follow? And my response to that is they follow the overarching principles of the organization. We have a great parallel in the United States. We follow the Constitution. We swear allegiance to the Constitution, not to the president. So at the highest level, the citizens and the military of the United States are following this ideal of democracy that's encaptured by the Constitution. So I'm going to say that's my response to George's question. Okay, so how do you transition your employees? What we did was we just told them, just use these words. Now, this was a lot of fun because some guys immediately got it, and they loved it. And they just said, I intend to. But we always would get new people from other ships, and we would get new guys from the Naval Academy, and they'd be trying to ask permission. And it was always fun because I would stand there. I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't say that's wrong. I wouldn't say try. I just look at him like with his dumb face and this silly smile. And then some seaman in the corner of the control room would yell out, "Hey, Lieutenant, try, I intend to." And you just practice it, and it becomes habit. And they love it. Very quickly, they love it. There were a couple guys, people ask me, well, yeah, but there are a few people just want to follow, right? And I think that's true, but it's a very, very, very small percentage. And these typically self-select out of your organization. So I would just say, just start practicing the words. Practice the words. Talk your way into a new way of thinking. Okay, Andy's asking a question. Now, Andy Warshak was with me on the Santa Fe, and the first group I went after on the Santa Fe, and Andy will remember this, was the Chiefs. Now, normally you say, well, go at the top. And that's not where I went, because we had this meeting with the Chiefs. My sense was the Chiefs were the linchpin. They were the key middle management. And there was the greatest deal of frustration with the Chiefs. So I would say, look at where's the greatest frustration? Where's the leverage point? And we did work with the Chiefs that really had an unbelievable impact. And the next year we re-enlisted 33 sailors, and it wasn't. And one of the reasons was because the sailors would look up and they said, "Well, when I grow up, I'm going to be a chief." And instead of having a job that meant nothing, now we're looking forward to jobs that meant stuff. Okay, people lead. Yeah. So if you're not, like Eric Parkening, this is a great question. If you're not the leader of your organization, how do you implement this? It's hard. On one hand, you can do small things within your department. Have your, maybe try and talk to the boss about some of these things. Send them some of the newsletters or the things that I send out. Because I think if the argument is, look, we need to unshackle our people. We need to remove the brakes. We need to let them think for their own. I like to think of a factory. I'm picturing a factory floor. In the days of the Industrial Revolution, I can look out, I see the sewing machine arms going up and down. I can measure productivity. I can see an idle sewing machine out of 100. Now, with intellectual work, it's totally different. I look out. I'm a bond trader. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I can't tell whether that person's daydreaming or not. I get a sense from their work how the quality is, but it's hard to know whether they could be doing 3 times as well. All right. Tara's question is, it's a good question. How do you motivate people to care about and be accountable for their work when they've never been accountable for results? On the ship, we had what we called eyeball accountability. We didn't yell, we didn't scream, but when we did things, so for example, one of the things we did with the Chiefs was you said, okay, Chiefs, you now own the leave process. You now are going to decide, you're going to be the final signature on a leave check. And you can put whoever you want on leave, but you're going to be responsible for how your division performs. And when things didn't go well, I just called them into the statement, just looked at them. We had eyeball to eyeball. It was very personal. We invested the time, one-on-one time with people to make sure that they knew I was interested in the long term. And part of it, there's a commitment here on the leadership. The leadership has to also take care of their people. This is also coming to mind. If they wake up in the morning and they say, man, I don't know what that guy does, but when he wakes up, my boss, when he wakes up, the only thing he thinks about is how to make my life better, they're going to give you everything they can. So that's about how I'd answer that. Let's see. How do you sustain? Okay, Chris Williams asked a question. As a follow-up to Matt's question, how do you sustain this? Is it self-sustainable as people feel a sense of accomplishment and value? That's the key part. Yes. And what happens is when you decouple performance from the leader, the particular leader can leave the ship. He leaves the ship. He leaves the organization. And the organization continues to do as well as it was doing or even better. There are many people, we all know them, who want to be missed. That's not leadership. That's egotism. That's narcissism. You don't want to be missed. I mean, I'm not sure what I'm saying. You want the organization not to miss you. You want the performance to continue, because when you do that, then you know you've embedded the goodness in the people and in the organization. So there are a series of these mechanisms a long series of these mechanisms, and I'll continue to talk about them in my newsletter, talk about them on my blog, and I welcome any comments or feedback to my email. So it's 1:30, so the formal event is over. Michelle from LC, I don't know, can we, just go on for a few more minutes, or how does this work?
Yeah, we have it for a few more minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to, let's see, what's the next couple questions? West Page. How critical is the role clarity for each individual when it comes to decision making? What I think is really important is we would talk about decoupling the decision. I think you really want to map out the decision. There's the approval of the decision, and in some cases, for legal reasons, I, as a captain, still had to approve certain decisions. For example, the use of force. I still had to approve any use of force. If we were to shoot a torpedo or a missile, I had to approve that. But the making of the decision, we would talk about this. Push the making of the decision down to the lowest possible level, and then maybe even lower that you're uncomfortable with, and let the approval come at a high level. There's some collaboration tool that you can use. You can get everyone to vote. Hey, where should we position the ship? Everyone gets a dot. They put a dot on the chart. Then we make a decision. So the other principle I would use is above and below the waterline. Some decisions are much more risky than others. As a captain of a nuclear-powered submarine, you don't want to hear, hey, we had a great idea for how to start the reactor up, and we tried it out. Let's tell you how it went. No, that's below, we call that below the waterline. You take a hole below the waterline, your ship is going to sink. But there are a lot of decisions above the waterline, and what happens is you get visibility. Just because the decision's made at a low level doesn't mean you don't know what it is. It doesn't mean that it's made in dark. It's communicated. That's got to be a key part to it. Thanks for letting me talk about that. Robert Miller, let's see. How did you react to those who did not follow the directive? Big stick, coaching and counseling. Usually the majority do not like change and act as a cancer throwing robots in its path. Okay. I had some things going for me which were very powerful. As I said, the ship was not doing well, so there was this thirst for change. So that was easy, and I had it easier. Because initially I was thinking, oh, my God, this is a disaster. But then I realized there were three things going for me. One, there was an innate thirst for change. Two, my bosses were basically saying, look, whatever it takes, do whatever it takes. And three is it was a new ship for me. I'd never been on the ship before. And so I had to rely on my crew even more than I normally would have. And so that countered a natural tendency for me to fall into the normal leadership role. And it forced me to be in this more curious, questioning, relying upon my guys leader. I think those three things were were key. Now, there were people who didn't play the game, who never got it. And in a couple cases, they self-selected out of the program. They found excuses to leave. They found programs to go to, and we encouraged that, and they went off. In one case, I had to actually fire a guy, one of my senior enlisted assistants, and that was sad. So I think the answer is maybe a combination of those things, and you just get a sense from the person. Am I going to spend a lot of time and they're never going to get it? I mean, some people are so wed to the old way of doing business, it's never gonna sink in, and they're so fearful of taking responsibility for their decisions that they're never going to step up. And in that case, I think you just gotta cut bait. Now, you only have a limited number of silver bullets to shoot in a submarine, and we only ended up firing one guy, which was it was a mistake that he was sent to us in the role that he was sent. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up in here, and I really appreciate everyone's participation. And, you know, what the vision I have is, as a country, we have these problems that we're not going to get solved using the old command and control leadership model. We need everyone thinking actively, creatively, participating, taking ownership, committing their full mental energies to solving these problems. And I think with the help of people who are sort of embracing this new model and letting people, releasing the brakes on their employees, we're going to get there. So thank you very much. Send me an email, send me your comments, subscribe to my newsletter, and we'll see you around the block. Thank you very much.